Previously on The Revolution, a mysterious Prussian arrived at Valley Forge to train the only army that would have him, Washington's battered Continentals.
Baron von Steuben's genius was the ability to distill state-of-the-art European drill tactics to this raw material that was the American soldier.
That army and its commander are now convinced that they can beat any army on the face of the earth, and they are eager for the fight. And that fight comes on one of the hottest days of the war.
Monmouth became the war's longest, most brutal battle.
When the smoke had cleared at Monmouth, it was a draw. This new army that had come out of Valley Forge held their own against the British. This renews the public's spirit for the war.
July 4th, 1778. It is the second anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the second birthday for what will become a new nation, the United States of America. For the soldiers, a day of celebration. And for their leader, General George Washington, a time of renewed confidence. It has been a week since the Continentals took on the British Army at the New Jersey crossroads of Monmouth Courthouse. It was one of the hottest days of the war, and the Americans, fresh from a winter's worth of training at Valley Forge, stood up to the full force of the British. More than 20,000 soldiers clashed on the field. The battle raged for hours in the stifling afternoon heat. But the Continentals held their ground.
Washington knew and the country knew that this new army was a good one. They had held their own against the British. This renews the public's spirit for the war and solidifies Washington's position as the unquestioned commander-in-chief.
After the battle, the British withdraw to their stronghold in New York City, giving Washington hope for a brighter future in the war. The British pullout means the rebel capital, Philadelphia, has returned to American hands. And in the main chamber of Independence Hall, the Continental Congress is back in session. Across town at City Tavern, a crowd is gathering for an Independence Day celebration. The July 4th celebration is a who's who of Philadelphia's high society. Congressmen, statesmen, and wealthy merchants are all in attendance. Also at the gathering is one of the most revered generals of the Revolution, the man personally installed by George Washington as Philadelphia's military governor, Benedict Arnold. Arnold was born into a prominent Connecticut family, but his alcoholic father squandered the family's fortune. Determined to overcome his lowly circumstances, he has become a celebrated war hero through sheer will. In 1775, Arnold helped lead a daring mission to snatch the remote outpost, Fort Ticonderoga, from the British. But the credit for the victory went to the bold frontiersman Ethan Allen, a cruel blow to Arnold's honor. 2 years later, it was Benedict Arnold who rallied the Americans to victory in the Battle of Saratoga, but at a high price. Arnold took a bullet to the leg and barely survived being crushed by his horse.
When the battle was over, his second-in-command said, "Sir, where are you hit?" And Arnold said, "It's my leg. I wish it had been my heart." And I do too. I wish it had been in his heart, because if he had died at that moment, he would have been the great hero of the Revolution.
Adding insult to injury, literally, credit for the victory went to Horatio Gates, the leader of America's Northern Army. It is another in a growing list of slights against Arnold.
Gates doesn't mention Arnold in his dispatches and garners all the glory for himself. The people and the press hailed Gates as the new American hero. In fact, the hero of the battle was Benedict Arnold.
Now crippled by the injury from Saratoga, Arnold has had to relinquish his battlefield command for a new charge from George Washington: to restore order to Philadelphia, a city still reeling from the 8-month occupation by the British.
Philadelphia under the British was a place of terrible suffering for the poor who couldn't afford to buy any food or fuel. It was a place where dozens of American prisoners of war died every day. The houses were in shambles. There was nothing to eat. There were people begging in the streets.
The British occupation has helped radicalize the city. Mobs take to the streets for public demonstrations, where prostitutes dressed as loyalists are paraded around town, a display of hatred towards any who sympathize with the British. And in heated backroom debates, both the state and continental governments are seeking to reassert their political power over Philadelphia. It creates a precarious situation, one that the headstrong general is ill-equipped to handle.
Benedict Arnold has something of a prickly personality. He is not the kind of person that an acquaintance would probably go out of the way to compliment to other people. He is vain, he's somewhat self-serving, he's somewhat self-interesting, and those that don't already like him are not inclined to do him any favors.
In addition, with his haughty manner and fancy dress, Arnold looks to many just like a Tory, a loyalist. Around town, Arnold and his expensively dressed friends wear the wigs and fineries associated with the British. But it is Arnold's actions as military governor that cause a stir.
Arnold's first act was to close all the stores. He said to take an inventory of what there was available to supply the army and the civilians. But immediately the accusations began to fly that he was cornering the market on goods that he was going to sell himself. I don't think Benedict Arnold was doing anything as a commanding officer in Philadelphia that many of the other generals on both sides did as a matter of custom. Officers got a percentage, commissary generals got a commission, and he was only doing what others did.
Arnold does little to help his cause by regularly entertaining suspected loyalists. There is one in particular who catches his eye. A younger lady, demure, quiet, intense, lovelier than the rest, Peggy Shippen. At 18, Peggy is half Arnold's age and is the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia, the judge and merchant Edward Shippen. The Shippens tried to maintain their neutrality under the British occupation, but are strongly suspected of being loyalists. Like many of Philadelphia's society women, Peggy kept company with British officers over the winter of 1778. One of her closest companions was British General Clinton's ambitious aide-de-camp, a young man by the name of Major John Andre. Shippen's friendship with Andre has not ended with a withdrawal from Philadelphia. Through her friends, she still hears from the British officer. It is a relationship that ties her dangerously close to the enemy. Arnold is taken with the young Shippen and begins an intense courtship that captures her heart and culminates with their marriage.
Peggy Shippen, from the time she was about 5, had heard about Benedict Arnold. The newspapers were always full of his exploits. She was a gorgeous young woman. She was extremely well educated by her father, self-educated as well, could run a business which appealed to a Yankee merchant like Arnold. Today they would be considered a dynamite couple, and I think they saw themselves in that term right away.
But they are also a couple under scrutiny. For his extravagant parties and questionable business dealings, Arnold comes under fire in the press. They are deadly serious charges: corruption, abuse of power, leveled by an anonymous source. Once again, Arnold faces a slight against his honor. But this time, his integrity is called into question. It is an attack that may push him too far. summer 1778, the Continental Army has proven its mettle at the Battle of Monmouth, a battle that has solidified George Washington's position as the American commander-in-chief. The British have withdrawn to New York City, and the colonial capital, Philadelphia, is back in American hands. Washington entrusts the city to one of his most celebrated generals, Benedict Arnold, who is now the military governor. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Paris, another celebrated patriot is anxiously awaiting news from the colonies. Benjamin Franklin, America's great statesman and emissary to France, is expecting word on the arrival of the French fleet in America. The internationally renowned scientist and statesman has been heartily enjoying the fine wine and refined women of France for the past year, and has used his patient diplomacy to convince this great superpower and enemy of the British to join the American side of the war. Now, 12 ships of the line under the command of the French Admiral Comte d'Estaing are under sail to aid the American cause. The hope is that the French fleet will help bring the war to a quick end, but the news from America is not good. A storm wreaks heavy damage to the ships, crippling the fleet and eliminating any chance of engaging the British.
The whole Franco-American alliance, it's a very, very awkward alliance. And it gets off to a very wobbly start. This makes up the impression that the French are a bunch of cowards who haven't really come to our rescue anyway. And so this much trumpeted alliance with our saviors, the French, begins to sound like it's a pipe dream. And Franklin's job from France is very much to eliminate that idea and to paint a happier picture of the alliance, to uplift the alliance, because this is our only hope.
To that end, Franklin engages in his own special brand of diplomacy, talking politics while socializing over games of chess in the salons of Paris. But Franklin's playful flirtations raise some eyebrows, in particular from an old nemesis who has recently arrived in France, John Adams. The 42-year-old New England conservative is one of the original firebrands who helped spark the American Revolution and is now an American envoy. Adams has been dispatched to work with Franklin at building the alliance with the French, but the two couldn't be a more unlikely pairing.
Franklin and Adams are a little bit like oil and water. They're two inherently different men. Adams arrives in France and he is a man of schedules, he's a man of efficiency, he wants an answer now. Franklin realizes that what he's conducting is diplomacy, and diplomacy is not conducted in this rather rigid-minded way. So Adams' perception of Franklin is that he's dilatory, and he spends an enormous amount of time socializing, and that he's a little bit overly patient with things, and that he never gets a straight answer. That is all of it a definition, of course, of diplomacy.
Adams may be impatient, but for now there is little that can be done. So the mismatched couple will have to bide their time, until the day the French Navy can finally come to the aid of the American cause. Back in the colonies, the fall of 1778 brings old problems to the doorstep of General George Washington. His army again faces chronic shortages, limited food, tattered clothing, and dwindling supplies, all compounded by an additional problem: no pay. It is a strain that weighs heavily on Officer Joseph Hodgkins, a 35-year-old cobbler from Massachusetts, who has dutifully served in the war since its outset. Hodgkins has not been paid in months, a reality that is pushing even the most dedicated soldiers to weigh their commitment to the war against the needs of their families.
My dear, you say in your letter that you are afraid that I shall stay in the cause of liberty till I shall make myself a slave to it. I have too much reason to fear that will be the case. I hope to come home soon and see you. Wishing you good night. Your most kind and affectionate husband till death, Joseph Hodgkins.
For women like Joseph's wife, Sarah, life outside of the war has brought its own set of difficulties. In addition to raising their children, tending to the family business fills her days. And with the value of paper money dropping to 3 to 4 cents on the dollar, budgets are stretched and families are feeling the strain. The problems on the home front begin to have an impact in Washington's ranks. Many officers resign their commissions and return to civilian life to provide for their families. But as veterans of the fight for independence begin streaming out of the war, another group is finding their way in. Slaves. They come from Rhode Island, a state desperate to fill its recruitment quotas, and are joining the fight seeking something all Americans are after: freedom. Slaveholding is common across many of the colonies during the Revolution, from the North to the South. And although the colony of Rhode Island was founded on principles of tolerance and equality, it has grown as a major port and market in the international slave trade. Now, Rhode Island's politicians see an untapped resource for filling their ranks.
The Rhode Island Regiment comes from a region that was, for the North, one of the major slave-holding regions. If they'd been in the South, they'd have been called plantations, but these are the largest slave-holding estates in the entire North. In order to fulfill their quota commitment, they offer to send some of their slaves. Now, in return for fighting for the Continental Army, the slaves are offered freedom.
The slaves are not the only ones tendered an offer. The Rhode Island government offers compensation to the slave owners for their property. But it is still up to the individual slave to agree to the enlistment.
Here's your choice. You can remain a slave, or you can support this new nation, and as a result of that support, this new nation and your master will recognize your freedom. Now, obviously, this is a very difficult situation because you can't be sure that you're going to get freedom if you fight. But the one thing you can be sure of, if you don't fight, you're going to remain a slave.
Soon, 1 out of every 4 able-bodied slaves in Rhode Island enlists in what becomes known as the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And although George Washington once stood in opposition to having black slaves serve in his army, the new recruits are a welcome boost to his manpower-starved force.
One thing we should always remember, from the beginning of this country to the present, African Americans have had a certain faith in the American dream. And I'm not talking about 2 cars in every garage. I'm talking about the American dream of personal freedom and opportunity. That's something that America, in its rhetoric, handed out to the world from the very beginning as the reasons for its existence. I think many African American slaves took that seriously.
Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the case against Benedict Arnold continues to build in the press. Serious charges that will have to be answered. Winter 1779. George Washington again faces crippling shortages of soldiers and supplies for his fighting force. Some of his officers have even begun to leave the ranks. It is another uphill struggle, not just for the Continental Army, but also for the military governor of Philadelphia, Benedict Arnold. The charges of corruption and abuse of power circulating in the press have been getting more frequent and more serious.
The essence of the charges against Arnold were that he had abused his office for his own personal profit, closing the shop so he could rake off business from those. He was just doing what was common practice at the time, but he got nailed for it.
The identity of the once anonymous person leveling the accusations is now known. The President of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, in essence, the governor, Joseph Reed. The powerful Reed is a veteran of the Revolution who served under George Washington at the battles of New York and Brandywine. There he gained the confidence of the commander-in-chief. Reed's strong patriot zeal is matched only by his dislike for anything that smacks of loyalism. Now a civilian politician, Reed is on a mission to take the control of Philadelphia out of the hands of the Army and return it to his command under the state of Pennsylvania. And Arnold will be his sacrificial lamb. Reed publishes that 8 charges are being drawn up against Benedict Arnold. Stung by the accusations, Arnold launches an attack of his own, defending his actions and his honor.
Arnold did not believe that American Army officers such as himself should take any orders from a governor of Pennsylvania. And Reed did not believe that anyone was immune from the power of the civilian population. It really was a standoff between the two.
The heated exchange lasts for months in the Philadelphia press and catches the eye of another powerful body, the Continental Congress, which decides to take the matter into its own hands and convene a hearing. March 5th, 1779. In front of a Congressional Investigative Committee, Arnold answers the charges leveled against him.
Arnold wanted to defend himself in the eyes of the American people as well as his fellow officers. And his statement is really a recitation of all that he did and all that he had lost. He'd been crippled for life. He'd been passed over for promotion several times. And he thought he had lost his honor with its lingering cloud over him.
After Arnold's eloquent defense, the committee rules that there is no intentional wrongdoing and refers the matter along to a friendly audience for the general, a military council. For Arnold, it is a victory, and at his request, a hearing date is set for May. But Joseph Reed has more plans for Arnold. He renews his attacks in the press and renews a correspondence with his old commander, George Washington. Reed demands that all of the charges be reinstated against Arnold and backs it with a threat of removing Pennsylvania's support and supplies from the war.
He tried to blackmail Washington. If Washington didn't court-martial Benedict Arnold, Washington would not have the army wagons he needed to move his armies the next year.
Desperate for supplies, Washington sees no choice but to consider the possibility. And in a terse, polite letter, postpones Arnold's hearing indefinitely.
When Washington agreed to the postponement, it really horrified Benedict Arnold. And he wrote probably his most wrenching letter to Washington at that time. If you think I'm guilty, well then try me and execute me. But after all I've done, don't leave me hanging and twisting here this long. And the day he wrote that letter to Washington, that is the turning point.
Now, Benedict Arnold, the bold American general, the savior at Saratoga, the capturer of Fort Ticonderoga, does the unthinkable. And with encouragement from his wife Peggy, reaches out to her old friend and enemy combatant, British Major John Andre, who is now the head of British intelligence. Arnold sends the dispatch signed only with the code name Monk. It offers information on the Continental Army in return for money. But above all, for the aggrieved Arnold, it is his way out of the American Army, which to him and Peggy has never fully appreciated his sacrifice and his service. As the war drags into its 4th year, frustrations begin to mount. Officer Joseph Hodgkins is again on the move. Memories of the failed battles still fresh in his mind. It is now clear that the end of the war, seemingly so close last summer, is but a distant hope. And at home, times are increasingly difficult. On just a soldier's pay, the Hodgkins family finances are stretched to the limit. For Joseph, it is time to go home to Ipswich, Massachusetts. "4 years, 4 months, and 27 days after turning out for the alarm at Lexington, Hodgkins resigns his commission and quits the war. He resumes his life as a citizen, a shoemaker, a husband, and a father, and will never return to the front lines again. The loss of veteran soldiers like Joseph Hodgkins hits Washington's army hard, especially now, as the war is pulled to a new, far-flung frontier. Indian raids on villages to the west have commanded the attention of Congress and the country, and revenge is being demanded. 1779 is shaping up to be a slow year for the Continental Army. Battlefield plans have been made and discarded. Rumors of British movements received, some true, some false. Just one assault, demanded by Congress and ordered by George Washington, will be the major campaign of the year. A foray north into the lands occupied by the nation of the Iroquois. Stretching east to west across land that will become New York State, the Iroquois nation consists of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. It is the largest confederation of tribes in the Northeast, and would be a powerful addition to either side in the Revolution. For most of the war, Native American involvement has been a limited affair, various tribes making short-term deals for individual battles. Now, the Iroquois nation, like all who live on American soil, find themselves in a position to take a side in the war.
It's not a great option. It's the least painful option, or the option that seems to serve their interests. Partly it's a calculation about who is going to win this war, the British or the Americans.
But the British have an inside track, a strong connection to a Mohawk warrior named Joseph Brant. Born in Ohio, his Indian name, Thayendanegea, translates as "he who places 2 bets," an appropriate name for a man who has spent his life straddling white and Indian society. Born to Mohawk parents, he was introduced at an early age to a man of great wealth, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson, who took Joseph under his wing and raised him as his own son. Brant's family connection with Sir William Johnson lands him on a far-flung trip across the sea to another land, Great Britain. Presented as a representative of the Iroquois people, Brant meets with King George III and is promised that his people will be able to keep their lands after the war if they side with the crown. It is a promise Brant takes back with him to America, and he brings his case before the Iroquois Tribal Council.
There was a grand debate, reminiscent of our own debate about independence. All the warriors and the leaders and women were included in this debate as well. Joseph Brant started off. He said, "We have to join with somebody, because somebody's going to win." To which another respected warrior said, "War is war. Death is death. A fight is a hard business. We should be cautious before taking up the hatchet." This is a classic debate between hawks and doves. We see it over and over in history. And here it was in the Indian Council among the Iroquois. As in many such debates, the hawks prevailed.
It is a decision that comes at a high price. 4 of the Iroquois tribes agree to take up arms for the British. But the Oneida and Tuscarora, swayed by missionaries loyal to the American cause, refuse Brant's appeal. Now, a divided people, the great council fire of the 6 nations, a symbol of tribal unity, is ritually extinguished. Once under British command, Brant and his warriors are ordered to raid villages along the New York frontier. But although they are fighting for their own land, Brant is portrayed much differently in the American press. He becomes known as the Monster Brant. Newspapers fill with vivid accounts of attacks. Yet there are few articles of the vicious retaliation and assaults by American settlers. The press coverage of the Indian raids has an immediate effect, and George Washington is ordered by the Continental Congress to mount an offensive against the Iroquois, as they call them, the savages. Washington deploys the mission and leaves no doubt as to the goal.
The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. Lay waste all the settlements around, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. George Washington.
The language that the Americans use about overrunning and destroying is language that they would not use about the British. That was not how they were going to fight the British. They were going to do that in a very controlled way, whereas against Indians, it's the entire population who's under attack.
August 1779, 4,500 Continental soldiers descend upon their first target, the Iroquois border town of Newtown, New York. Washington's forces burn the village to the ground, and a mass exodus begins ahead of the advancing army. Thousands of Iroquois from the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes march overland to the safety of the British forts to the west at Niagara.
The people, the Indian villages, the orchards, the wheat fields, the corn fields, in other words, a scorched earth policy. It was intense. Nothing quite like it until Sherman's march through Georgia in American military annals.
If the idea was to destroy Indian resistance, it didn't work. The warriors had nothing left to live for other than to fight. So they continued to raid against the Patriot settlements the next year. As one American officer commented, the nests are destroyed, but the birds are still on the wing.
With the Iroquois now forced from their lands, George Washington turns his attention to another pressing matter. A decision on one of his most renowned generals, Benedict Arnold. Washington is eager to get the bold general back into the fight for the American cause, and is considering Arnold for a major field assignment.
Whenever George Washington needed an experienced field commander, he called on Benedict Arnold. Arnold knew that you had to attack the British, get out there and hit them and hit them and hit them again.
But before Washington can act on a new commission for Arnold, there is a political matter to tend to. A final ruling in the case against Arnold. Charges of profiteering while in charge of Philadelphia. Charges leveled by the governor of Pennsylvania, Joseph Reed. Reed, in his personal quest to show his power by seeing Arnold convicted, has backed the charges with a threat to withdraw Pennsylvania's support for the war. And Washington, needing all the supplies he can get, sees no choice but to give in. He issues a harsh rebuke against Arnold to placate Reed. But once the affair blows over, Washington can finally make General Arnold a glorious offer: a return to a field command. With no knowledge of Joseph Reed's threat, Arnold receives Washington's decision. The words are stinging, reprehensible, imprudent, improper. For the embattled American general, it is the last straw. Passed over for promotion, gravely injured at Saratoga, and now reprimanded by Washington, Arnold is pushed over the edge. Benedict Arnold will betray America. Arnold contemplates his terms. 20,000 pounds and a command of his own. Brigadier General in the British Army.
Arnold had changed since the revolution began. He felt that he'd been given a very raw deal. I think the biggest misconception about Arnold's treason is he did it for the money. I don't think he did. I don't think it was as simple as that. He did it for his pride. The money was secondary.
In return, Arnold will offer a mighty fort to the Royals. It is the key to defending the Hudson River and even bears the general's name, Fort Arnold, also known as West Point. Benedict Arnold has received a harsh rebuke from the American Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. It is the final straw for the brash general and pushes him over the edge. With the help of his wife, Benedict Arnold reaches out to British Major John Andre with an offer. Money and a command of his own in return for the American stronghold that bears his name, Fort Arnold, also known as West Point. Just 60 miles north of New York City, West Point is a critical post on the banks of the Hudson River. Located in the middle of the Hudson Highlands, the fortress guards a sweeping S-curve in the mighty river.
At West Point, the river remains tidal, which is to say at some times of the day it flows south and at other times of the day it flows north. This made West Point an ideal place to mount cannons on both sides of the river as ships had to navigate this very tricky curve.
It is a prize that the British have coveted since the beginning of the war, but have never been able to take with a military offensive. Now, Arnold offers to deliver the post and begins to lobby George Washington for command of the fort. August 1st, 1780. George Washington summons Benedict Arnold to a meeting just south of West Point, New York. Washington has a surprise for the general, a powerful field assignment and glorious return to action. Control of the entire left wing of the Continental Army, and with it, 1/2 of America's best infantry. Washington takes his leave. The offer on the table is something that Benedict Arnold would have jumped at just months earlier, but his treasonous plot has been set in motion. Flustered, he pleads he is too crippled to assume the command. Only a stationary post. A desk job will do. It is a reaction that leaves the Commander-in-Chief confused.
George Washington was puzzled that Benedict Arnold would want the command of West Point. Washington wanted to put him back into the line of battle as his number 3 general. But Arnold insisted on West Point because that was the deal with the British.
Arnold refuses to back down, and Washington finally yields. The command of West Point is his. August 3rd. Now in charge, Arnold wastes no time in laying the groundwork for his treason.
As the new commandant of West Point, Benedict Arnold deliberately weakened the fortifications, transferred men to distant posts where they couldn't reinforce in a British attack, moved guns around, and would have made it very easy for the British to take the place.
Arnold prepares detailed intelligence on West Point. Troop numbers and positions, the number and location of the cannon, details of the surrounding terrain, and sends word to British Major John Andre that he is ready for a meeting. Arnold's treason is just days away. September 21st, 2 a.m. Just south of West Point, on the banks of the Hudson River, Benedict Arnold and John Andre meet for the first and last time. Arnold goes over the plans with Andre in great detail, making sure they are clear, that no question goes unanswered, that the plot is complete. It is a thoroughness that takes time. The meeting lasts for more than 2 hours, and when the two part company, Andre carefully slips the plans into his boot. September 24th. Breakfast at the Arnold residence is a seemingly normal affair. Today, Arnold is expecting a special guest, General George Washington. It will be his last meeting with Washington, after which he and Peggy will slip behind enemy lines. But Arnold receives a dispatch that changes everything. John Andre has been captured, and on him the plans to West Point. Arnold believes that it is only a matter of time before the plot is uncovered. He rushes to Peggy's room. Together they burn any evidence of the treasonous plot. And taking 2 pistols and a horse, Arnold makes a hasty getaway. When Washington arrives at the Arnold home, it is clear that something is amiss. An officer brings the news of Andre's capture and the confiscated documents. But Arnold is nowhere to be found. The terrible, incredible truth strikes him. Only one man could generate such detailed maps: the commandant of the fort. Benedict Arnold is sold out to the British. The remaining question is, who else knew of the plot? Washington goes to Peggy Shippen's room. But to the commander's eyes, she is suffering from the shock of her husband's treason.
When Washington arrives at the house, she is weeping, crying that this terrible thing has happened. She's had nothing to do with it. She knows nothing about it. Washington buys this.
George Washington was a sexist. He didn't believe a woman could have pulled off such an act or been at the heart and the brain of such a plot.
October 2nd, noon. 10 days after his capture, John Andre is the one who pays for the treason of Benedict Arnold. His request for an officer's death by firing squad is denied. He will suffer the death of a spy and hang. Ever the honorable English gentleman, Andre puts on his own blindfold and his own noose. At just 30 years of age, John Andre is both the youngest and highest-ranking officer executed in the Revolution. In British-held New York City, there is a new officer in their ranks. A Connecticut-born patriot, a hero in the revolutionary cause, British Brigadier General Benedict Arnold.
Were it not for his treason, he would almost undoubtedly be one of the most celebrated American commanders of all of the American Revolution. West Point to this day would probably still be called Fort Arnold rather than West Point.
If the Americans had lost the Revolution, Benedict Arnold would have been Duke Arnold, and Washington would have been hanged, drawn, and quartered. Treason's tricky. Depends on which side you are.
Arnold will follow the war to the southern states in charge of his own Loyalist brigade with his wife Peggy, now banished from Philadelphia, by his side. Arnold's treason is the highest in the young history of America. It is an act that shakes George Washington to the core. That one of his highest-ranking generals could betray the rebel cause raises questions. Who else might be considering the same? He will pursue Arnold throughout the rest of the war with a singular goal: to bring the traitor to justice. Next time on The Revolution, the British will shift focus to the southern colonies with a month-long siege of Charleston.
Charleston is the richest port in America at the time.
By moving south, they were moving to an area where they hoped they could restore British authority.
If the seizure of southern states doesn't work, it's not clear what will work.
I don't think anyone is more surprised than the British that they haven't won yet.
The question they're asking is, why isn't this thing over yet?
December 1779. As the fourth year of the American Revolution comes to an end, the war is at a stalemate. Many battles have been won and lost, but neither side has taken the advantage. British General Henry Clinton has a firm grip on New York City, but the King's forces have been unable to crush the rebellion, as George Washington's army continues to hold them in check. Now camped 30 miles to the west of New York City, the Americans are bracing themselves for another long winter. 13,000 strong, they settle into their quarters at Morristown, New Jersey. It has been 2 years since the Continental Army survived the legendary conditions at Valley Forge, but this winter will surpass all others.
The winter encampment in Morristown was a lot harder than the encampment in Valley Forge. Valley Forge seems to get all the press, but Morristown was really dire straits.
Valley Forge was a disaster because of the lack of supplies and the bungling. Morristown was the elements. It was said to be the worst winter in the history of North America. There were 26 snowstorms, 6 of blizzard proportions. It was so cold that in the month of January, on all but 2 days, the temperature was below freezing.
This is truly the winter that tries men's souls. At Valley Forge, it took 4 weeks to build the Army's cabins. But at Morristown, blizzard conditions slow the progress, and the construction takes months. Many soldiers are forced to sleep under canvas tents or lie in the snow. Compounding the soldiers' suffering is the fact that once again, food is in critically short supply.
The countryside is covered with snow, but really the areas of Morristown just does not have enough food to supply the army.
Soldiers fill their diaries with accounts of the cruel conditions.
We were absolutely, literally starved. I do solemnly swear that I did not put a morsel in my mouth for 4 days and as many nights, except a little black birch bark, which I gnawed off a stick of wood. I saw several of the men roast their old shoes and eat them. Private Joseph Plum Martin.
It is yet another low point in Washington's career. His desk piles high with letters from generals pleading for supplies. Washington petitions Congress for aid, but to no avail.
Inflation had soared to hundreds of %. The American money was practically worthless. And they had a hard time with taxes on the states, getting people to pay their taxes. Congress was nearly bankrupt. So it's catch as catch can.
With no food and few supplies, Washington faces the very real possibility of being forced to dissolve his army. Charleston, South Carolina. 800 miles to the south, it is a very different winter. 4 years into the war, the South is mostly untouched. Here in the bustling hub of commerce and trade, life goes on undisturbed. The wealthy partake heartily in the pleasantries of social life. Dances and dinners fill the evenings, a far cry from the hardships faced by an army fighting for their liberty. Charleston has been threatened only once by the British. A poorly executed attack in 1776 that was easily fended off. From the looks of it, Charleston is hardly part of a nation at war. All that is about to change. Across the ocean in England, a new strategy for the war is about to be unleashed. In the halls of Parliament, it has been a year scarred by angry debate. The British national debt has soared to over £160 million, due in large part to the prolonged war, and there is no end in sight.
I don't think anyone is more surprised than the British that they haven't won yet. They're a very wealthy nation. They have the most professionally trained army, and they have the most powerful navy in the world.
The question they're asking is, why isn't this thing over yet? This should have been an easy victory. And so there are questions about what to do next.
The figureheads of British leadership, like Prime Minister Lord North, are frequent targets in the daily papers, held responsible for a costly and increasingly unpopular war. A war where the stakes have been raised by the entrance of their archenemy, France, into the fight, on the American side.
Surrendering American independence is one thing, and that's something that has to be dealt with. But allowing France to emerge from this conflict with the upper hand is wholly unacceptable to the entire political nation, to all of the governing elite.
Under the gun now to turn the course of the fight, British policymakers unveil a dramatic new direction for the war. It becomes known as the Southern Strategy.
The British look at the map of the colonies and they think, well, we know Boston is just a hotbed, forget them. That was the first place we lost. We have these centers in New York, temporarily in Philadelphia, but the countryside is too unpredictable.
British hoped in the South to establish a foothold in North America that could be a permanent foothold. Here is the wealthiest part of the 13 colonies, right? Here are the major source of export goods, tobacco and grain and rice, and indigo and naval stores, right? All of these come from the southern colonies.
The key to the British Southern Strategy is the belief that their efforts would be supported by loyalists, the Americans still loyal to the Crown. The British believe they will be received as liberators, and that thousands of loyalist militia will pour out and join their cause.
The assumption was that most colonists, given the chance, would be loyalists. By moving south, they were moving to an area where they hoped that they could finally restore British authority and put the loyalists in charge.
All that remains now is putting their plan into action. December 26, 1779, British headquarters, New York City. With his orders from the British ministry now in hand, Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton makes preparations to carry them out. This is Clinton's first offensive action, one that is so important that he himself will lead the assault. But he is filled with a sense of foreboding. Clinton has watched two other British commanders fail at winning this war, and doesn't want his name added to the list.
If the seizure of the other southern states doesn't work, it's not clear what will work. Clinton is as concerned with how his actions will be interpreted, how he will be judged, that awareness of, if I don't handle this right, what's this going to mean for my reputation back at home?
The general's neck is squarely on the line. His success or failure could determine the outcome of the war, and no one knows it better than Clinton himself.
This is the most important hour Britain ever knew. If we lose it, we shall never see such another. British General Henry Clinton.
The British leave New York City with more than 100 ships and a force of 8,700. Roughly 1/3 of the British Army in America. Their destination, Charleston, South Carolina. News that the British fleet has set sail reaches Washington in Morristown, New Jersey. But the commander-in-chief is powerless. A cruel winter march south is no option for his starving army. He must let the British go. Charleston will have to fend for itself. January 1780. The British have launched an armada out of New York City. 8,700 soldiers heading for a southern offensive in Charleston, South Carolina. But Washington, with no navy, and his army snowed in at Morristown by the worst winter the war has seen, cannot follow, leaving Charleston and his southern army to fend for themselves. "800 miles south of Washington's winter camp, Benjamin Lincoln, the new commander of the Continental Southern Army, is assuming his duties. The Major General was dispatched south 3 months earlier by Washington himself, and is now in command of nearly 2,400 soldiers. But the Massachusetts farmer is an unlikely choice for a commander.
Benjamin Lincoln is one of the most interesting generals, perhaps, of the entire American Revolution. He's sort of a paradox. Lincoln is a rotund New England Continental Army officer. He suffers from sleep apnea, oftentimes falling asleep at the most inopportune moments, and he does not possess the kind of battlefield charisma that one would want in a combat commander. He is, however, a masterful compromiser. He is a great politician, and in large measure this helps explain the reason that he assumes command of the Southern Department.
Lincoln's task is first and foremost the defense of Charleston, South Carolina, the city known as the Jewel of the South. Clustered on a low, sandy spit of land, Charleston sits on a peninsula at the junction of the Ashley and Cooper rivers. It is the fourth largest city in America, with 12,000 residents. Its deep water harbor makes Charleston the South's most important port. Rice, indigo, and naval stores leave daily, headed to Europe and the West Indies.
You're looking at one of the richest sections of the colonies. Charleston, by value of its export, is the richest port in America at the time.
And nature has endowed Charleston with a superior defensive position. Surrounded by impassable swamps teeming with malaria-ridden mosquitoes, the terrain is forbidding to any who dare take it. January 10th, 1780. Benjamin Lincoln receives a dispatch from spotters along the coast. A massive British force is approaching. With his command barely underway, Lincoln will have to face down England's army. Lincoln immediately petitioned South Carolina's government to recruit and raise more troops. But his request is denied. It is not the first time the South Carolinians have frustrated the Patriot cause. Many view the colony's citizens as reluctant revolutionaries, voting for independence only under tremendous pressure from the other colonies. And on the floor of the Continental Congress, South Carolina's seeming unwillingness to raise troops has ignited heated debates.
How can South Carolina expect us to send our men to their support when they will do nothing for themselves?
The state of South Carolina may have thought we neglected them, but we know they neglected themselves.
But in this case, losing the coastal port of Charleston to the British would be too great an economic blow. So Congress promises General Lincoln 3,000 additional troops from Virginia and North Carolina. With a march of 500 miles ahead of them, it is unlikely the reinforcements will arrive in time. With his back against the wall, the New Englander proposes a last-ditch idea to South Carolina's government. Arm 1,500 black slaves and turn them into soldiers. If they refuse, Lincoln will leave Charleston to the British. South Carolina's response is immediate. The request is denied as totally impractical.
Even though their backs were to the wall when the British Army moved south, they could not bear the risk of putting weapons in the arms of black men.
They were very concerned about what might happen should they start arming their slaves. I mean, to arm those people you have formerly held in captivity might be a suicidal thing to do, and they understood this.
With reinforcements hundreds of miles away and no black recruits, the defense of Charleston is looking more and more futile.
At that point, Lincoln's choice was either to get the army out of the city and give it up, or to stay in the city. In the best of all possible worlds, Lincoln should have left Charleston and gone to the countryside.
But the general's sense of honor and duty prevents him from abandoning his post, and retreat, however wise, would open him to accusations of cowardice. Undermanned, undersupplied, and unsupported, Lincoln will make his stand at Charleston. He communicates his plight to his commander-in-chief, General Washington.
We remain unsupported by troops, unsupplied, and what adds to the unhappiness is the little prospect that our affairs will speedily be in a better channel. General Benjamin Lincoln.
But from New Jersey, there is little Washington can do. With his army half a country away and nearly starving, moving his sizable force south is out of the question.
Washington wants to send men from Morristown. He can't send men because the men he wants to send have no shoes. They can't walk, so no army is sent.
February 11th, 1780. After a harrowing journey on the frigid, windswept seas of the Atlantic, British General Henry Clinton and his force of nearly 9,000 soldiers finally reached their destination, landing 20 miles south of Charleston. The army now unloads and begins its northward march. On February 16th, the British crossed the Stono River, taking control of James Island, which sits right across the harbor from Charleston. Then, finally, at the end of March, crossed the Ashley River in force. The British Southern campaign is underway, and the city of Charleston is in their sights. The British Army has set out on a new course in the War for Independence, taking the fight to the southern colonies of America. Now, 8,700 soldiers, roughly one-third of the British Army in America, have come ashore in South Carolina, and under the command of General Henry Clinton have begun their push to close in on their goal, Charleston. At his headquarters within the city, General Benjamin Lincoln readies himself for the British assault. There is no sign of the 3,000 soldiers promised by Congress a month earlier, and his army is severely outnumbered. So the general prepares for his defense the only way he knows how. Lincoln rolls up his sleeves and grabs a shovel. The Massachusetts farmer throws his back into his command, working day and night right beside his men. The Americans build earthen walls, lay trenches, and create as many obstacles as possible, all designed to slow the progress of the British Army. But Lincoln knows that unless there are reinforcements, the outcome of this fight is inevitable. With the soldiers' resolve, Lincoln writes once again to his commander-in-chief, George Washington.
I can promise you nothing but a disposition to serve my country and to defend Charleston as long as opposition can be any avail. General Benjamin Lincoln.
April 1st, 1780, Day 1. 800 yards west of the American fortifications at Charleston, the British begin their offensive with a shovel rather than a cannon. General Clinton's goal is to take Charleston intact. If he destroys the town, he fears the citizens will refuse the Crown's authority. Instead, he will surround Charleston and conduct a highly structured, formal assault on the city. A siege.
A siege is a very methodical and time-consuming reduction of a strategic place. The engineers will begin to dig what is called the first parallel. Parallel trenches are essentially concentric circles dug around the post. The siege is rather similar to an incremental tightening of a noose.
Helping to construct the first British parallel is a labor force that is seeking its own freedom in the War of Independence, slaves who have joined the British side. They have come from the countryside, enticed by the Philipsburg Proclamation, a renewal of Lord Dunmore's 1775 edict. It offers freedom and land to any slave who joins the British cause.
The British understood the colonies. They knew that South Carolina's population, the majority of its population, was African American slaves. And they also knew that these African American slaves were a potential fifth column. If you think about it for a moment, if you are an army opposing an enemy and you know that that enemy holds under its grip people who are enslaved, and you know darn well that those people don't want to be enslaved and would do anything within their power to break that grip, it's only natural that you would use that to your advantage. And that's precisely what the British did.
Slaves can't just walk off the plantation and enlist with the British. They have to escape. For the slave families, it is a difficult and dangerous decision.
Some slaves are very likely to make the decision to run to the British, while others will stay on the plantation, say, no, I'm not willing to take the chance. I'll probably end up getting shot anyway. Those are the kinds of calculations that have to be made plantation by plantation, family by family.
Over time, thousands of slaves escape and go to the British lines to fight for their freedom.
When you are presented with the choice of staying in slavery or the very real possibility of having the bonds of slavery broken, that's no choice. So that slaves were often ready to throw in their lot with the British, even if they didn't know precisely what might happen, because, you know, it's not the choices that you want, but it's the choice that you have.
The siege of Charleston enters its 5th day, and the methodical work of the British assault continues. Nights are spent digging trenches, and by sunrise, each side wakes up just a little bit closer to the other. From his barracks in Charleston, an anonymous American soldier is just beginning to feel the effects of the attack and charts the British progress.
Last night the enemy continued their approaches. They erected a battery for 12 cannon. The batteries have thrown several shots into town, by which one of the inhabitants in King Street was killed.
Day 7. From the north comes the news American General Benjamin Lincoln has been waiting for. Relief is on the way. The Continental soldiers promised by Congress have arrived and are making their way into the city. Marching double time, they have made the 505-mile journey from Virginia in just 30 days. Charleston citizens greet the soldiers with cheers and the hourly pealing of bells. The celebration on the streets of Charleston stands in stark contrast to the somber mood of Benjamin Lincoln's headquarters. Rather than the 3,000 soldiers promised, the Virginians number just 750. These numbers fall far too short. Bearing down on the city are 10,000 British redcoats. Day 8. The British take their aim on Charleston Harbor as a group of warships runs the narrow channel under cannon fire from Fort Moultrie, the American outpost protecting the inlet. A Hessian soldier fighting on the British side witnesses the scene from the shore.
It was the most majestic, beautiful spectacle that one can imagine. The fort was veiled in fire and smoke, and the roar of 43 heavy guns resembled a terrible thunderstorm. Despite all dangers threatening the fleet, it sailed quite slowly past the fort with colors flying proudly. Captain Johann Ewald.
With his fleet now safely in Charleston Harbor, Henry Clinton's forces encircle nearly all of the city. Day 10. From their position of strength, the British now send the Americans an ultimatum: give up the fight and surrender. General Lincoln's response is immediate. He will not yield his post.
The protocol of war at that time mandated that the defending commander keep the fight up at least long enough to meet the minimal dictates of honor in that time. So the besieged commander would always routinely decline the first offer of surrender.
British General Henry Clinton has gotten the response he expected. It strengthens his resolve.
They will now defend the town, and when we take it, we shall take all in it. Sir Henry Clinton.
Day 14. The British parallels continue creeping closer and closer to Charleston. Shelling fills the days as hot lead rains on the town. Just one escape path remains open to the Americans. Along the Cooper River to a crossroads called Monk's Corner. Running through a series of shallow crossings along the river's edge, the route serves as the last communication link between Charleston and the South Carolina backcountry. A lone Continental garrison is stationed at Monk's Corner. Their charge is a vital one: keep the route open. For the British, it is the last target needed to encircle the city. The man charged with taking the post is a brash, young, ambitious cavalryman, Banastre Tarleton. The 24-year-old Tarleton is as ambitious as they come. Described as full of enterprise and spirit and anxious of every opportunity of distinguishing himself, he has risen quickly through the British ranks.
Banastre Tarleton is one of Clinton's most capable subordinate commanders. He is a dashing young cavalry commander, and he understands how to fight in this theater, but his actions are all directed at the decisive destruction of enemy combat power.
Tarleton is known for his daring, for moving his cavalry quickly, quick hits. He's also known for no restraint.
At Monk's Corner, Tarleton unleashes a daring plan on the Americans. A surprise attack. Under the cover of night, Tarleton and his men make their move. They strike fast, hard, and without mercy, catching the Continental garrison completely off guard. In the thick of the attack, an American officer's pleas for surrender are met with a saber. Monk's Corner becomes Tarleton's calling card. It is not the last time the Americans will face the brash cavalry officer. The final road out of Charleston is now closed. April 1780. The siege of Charleston, South Carolina enters its third week, with the British painstakingly inching their way towards the city's continental defenses. With the last road out now shut down, British General Clinton begins tightening his noose around the city's very neck. Day 18. Behind the defensive line, there is the terrifying and constant barrage of cannon fire. For an anonymous Continental soldier, the strain of the siege is beginning to show.
The enemy continued firing from their cannon, mortars, and small arms. A sentinel near the advanced redoubt had his arm shut off by one of our own cannon. The enemy continued to approach. And we hear that our cavalry have been defeated and that we lost between 20 and 30 killed and wounded among them.
It's hard for us today to imagine what it's like to be inside a city that's being besieged. You're worrying about these incessant artillery shells coming in, and you're probably worrying all the time about what eventually is going to happen. What's going to happen when the enemy gets in here?
Day 21. In the American headquarters, General Benjamin Lincoln finds himself in the middle of an angry debate. Some of his officers want to take a desperate action, a dangerous water retreat under cover of night.
Lincoln knows really he should leave the city. It was heated, a very heated confrontation.
But with the British fleet sitting just off the city, moving his force across a river would be suicide. So Lincoln sends out a flag of truce and a request for a 6-hour break from fighting. Having already rejected British General Clinton's offer of surrender, Lincoln now proposes his own terms. He will give up Charleston, and in return, his forces will be allowed to retreat for 10 days unmolested, with its arms, military stores, and baggage. In addition, he asks for the guaranteed protection of the residents' property. Those who wanted could sell their goods off and leave the city. It would be a free evacuation with the honors of war, the most lenient surrender in a formal siege. But British General Clinton will have none of it. His goal is complete capitulation by the Americans. He returns the note and includes his terms: a total surrender.
A total surrender or an unconditional surrender is perhaps one of the most humiliating defeats that an enemy can suffer. A commander will not make an offer or demand a total surrender or unconditional surrender unless he is confident in his ability to finish the job by force of arms.
Lincoln refuses the offer. The terms, unacceptable. It will be a fight to the end. Day 30. The British parallels have closed to within 500 feet of the earthen defenses protecting Charleston. At this distance, cannon can be fired with accuracy into the city. But even at this close range, the British are still looking for some sign of the effect of their barrage, some intelligence on the mood of their enemy. Clinton's men intercept a letter from an American militiaman to his wife. It confirms the state of mind in the besieged city.
Our affairs are daily declining. Nothing prevents Lincoln's surrender but a point of honor in holding out to the last extremity. This is nearly at hand, as our provisions will soon fail. The enemy have continued their approaches with vigor, and in a short time will plant the British standard on our ramparts. This will give a rude shock to the independence of America. The 13 stripes will be leveled in the dust, and I will owe my life to the clemency of a conqueror, Benjamin Smith.
Clinton publishes the letter for all his men to see and increases the cannon barrage. Day 38. In the American headquarters, Benjamin Lincoln is trying to salvage his defense, to hold out in hope of additional reinforcement or come up with some plan that might turn the course of the siege. Now, devastating news arrives from his lines. The South Carolinian militia has abandoned their posts within the city. And now the citizens of Charleston are saying that they have had enough. Major General Benjamin Lincoln, commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Army, has run out of options. The siege of Charleston has ground on for more than a month, and the British rain a constant barrage of cannon and mortar fire down upon the town. With Charleston completely surrounded, it is only a matter of time before British forces breach the defenses of the city and are able to overrun the town. Now General Clinton prepares a final offer for the Americans: complete and total surrender. Day 41. The terms of surrender reach General Benjamin Lincoln's desk, and he now faces the reality of his situation. The time has come to give up the fight, to yield his post. The British cannon finally falls silent. May 12, 1780. Surrender. America's Southern Army strikes the flag of its new nation and lays down its weapons. The entire Charleston garrison, more than 5,000 Continental soldiers and militia, are now prisoners to the British. It is the heaviest loss the Americans have suffered in the Revolution. General Benjamin Lincoln's war is over for now. He returns in defeat to his Massachusetts farm as a prisoner of the British on parole. Charleston, the jewel of the South, belongs to the King. British General Henry Clinton savors his victory. He cannot hide his optimism about a smooth and easy road to capturing the other southern colonies. He sends word home to England.
I hope I am not too sanguine when I say that both the Carolinas are conquered in Charleston. British General Henry Clinton.
In England, the news from America is cause for a much overdue celebration. It has been 3 years since their army, the most powerful in the world, has had such a decisive win. Finally, the tide of war is turning. The Southern strategy is a seeming success. Back in the American headquarters at Morristown, celebration is the last thing on George Washington's mind. The final dispatch from Charleston has arrived. His Southern army is now lost. It is another defeat for the Americans, one that the commander-in-chief had been powerless to stop. The brutal winter of 1780 has taken a mighty toll on his army.
It was a long winter. It snowed in May. Soldiers are starving.
The dire conditions have pushed some to the very edge. Dissension is growing in the ranks. Insubordination runs rampant. Some soldiers even threaten to take matters into their own hands, to mutiny. It is a decisive and dangerous moment for the Continental Army. George Washington must step forward and restore order. The Commander-in-Chief carefully chooses his moment to take action. May 26, 1780. 8 nooses, prepared for 8 men. They are soldiers brought here on a variety of charges: insubordination, forging documents, theft. All are sentenced to death. Washington orders the execution be held before the entire camp, for all of his men to see. It is a carefully choreographed event.
Washington wanted to use punishment, a capital punishment, particularly sparingly, but he also knew it was great theater.
All 8 were put on top of the gallows. Nooses were put around their heads. Their graves had been dug in front of the gallows, and their coffins, which he ordered manufactured, placed next to the graves.
The goal of a public execution is to instill awe in the audience, awe for the power of military authority. But you can make it into better theater by pardoning and offering a last-minute reprieve.
As they were about to be hung, a soldier stepped forward from the crowd. Reprieve. Reprieve from the Commander-in-Chief. 7 of the 8 were freed.
So you have both awe in the punishment and then gratitude for the reprieve, and the audience experience all of these things at the same time.
On this day, just one man will hang for his crimes. It is a warning to all in Washington's army of the consequence for insubordination. For Washington, these are some of the darkest days. The British Southern strategy flourishes, while simultaneously it looks as if the American army is coming undone at the seams. And without the army, there is no revolution.
I find our prospects are infinitely worse than they have been at any other period of the war. I look forward to the consequences with an anxiety not to be described. George Washington.
The Commander-in-Chief cannot help but question the future of the war he once called this glorious cause. Next time on The Revolution, Daniel Morgan's cat-and-mouse guerrilla tactics will draw the British deep into unknown southern territory.
He knows he can lead the British Army into indecisive conflicts that's going to spread the British Army thin.
This was the way wars were fought in the southern backcountry. This was not the way warfare was supposed to be conducted.
He really is a roughneck frontiersman. Hard drinking, hard fighting. He really is the stuff of fiction.
May 1780. The War of Independence now enters its 4th year, longer than anyone had imagined. Battle after battle has failed to bring either side closer to winning. In the North, where the Revolution began, the war has ground to a deadlock. But in the South, the fighting has just begun. With their victory in Charleston, South Carolina, the British set grander sights toward establishing authority across all the southern colonies. The colonies here would be a handsome prize for King George. It is a land rich in lucrative crops like tobacco and rice, and by all accounts, full of colonists loyal to the crown. The British expect to find little resistance. Here, at last, they would find colonists loyal to the king and eager to embrace the British Empire, especially for its protection and trade.
By moving south, they were moving to an area where they hoped that they could finally restore British authority and put the Loyalists in charge. The goal was always to try to isolate the rebellion. The assumption was that most colonists, given the chance, would be Loyalists.
For 4 years, the British have tried to find those colonists loyal to the Crown. For 4 years, they have encountered an America deeply divided. But now, down south, they believe they have their strongest foothold. The South needs England, and England needs the South. They will drive their strategy toward the backcountry. Into this frontier, the British send one of their most effective and ambitious officers, Colonel Banastre Tarleton. He is destined to become a household name in the South, only it will not be for bravery, but for brutality.
Tarleton is known for his daring, for moving his cavalry quickly, and the troops, quick hits. He's also known for no restraint. He's a little bit of a dandy, which was appropriate for that era, but he fights like a Tasmanian devil.
The British will not only raise and train a loyalist militia to keep peace in the South, they will hunt down rebels and destroy them. No one is better suited to that task than Tarleton. 100 miles from the coast, he closes in on the remains of the Continental Army in retreat from their defeat at Charleston. With great speed and agility, Tarleton's British cavalry catches up to a regiment of 350 Continentals under the command of Colonel Abraham Buford. He pursues them to a town called Waxhaws. Tarleton sends Buford a deadly threat.
You are now encompassed by a corps of 700 light troops on horseback. Half of that number are light infantry with cannon, the rest cavalry. Banastre Tarleton, British officer.
It's a bluff. Tarleton has no more than 200 men, but they are his best soldiers, well trained in the bayonet and saber. Buford, sure that he has the greater numbers, doesn't back down.
Sir, I reject your proposals. I shall defend myself until the last extremity. Colonel Abraham Buford.
Buford's words will prove prophetic. The Americans are able to fire just a few volleys before they are overrun. But Tarleton doesn't stop there. As the rebels raise the white flag of surrender, he continues a ferocious attack, cutting down enemy soldiers even as they lay down their arms. It will soon be remembered as the Waxhaws Massacre.
Our captain attempted to defend his head with his left arm until the arm was hacked off. His head was then laid open to the eyes. Continental soldier.
Waxhaws is a painful loss for the Americans. But they will turn their defeat into another kind of victory on the propaganda front.
The Battle of the Waxhaws is used by patriot propagandists to depict the British as monsters who will massacre their soldiers in a dishonorable fashion and ride roughshod over the countryside. Any occupying force trying to subdue a rebellion on the home soil of an insurgency is going to operate at a disadvantage when it comes to the propaganda war.
Waxhaws will be remembered and used as a battle cry against the British. It sets the tone for the divisive war coming in the backcountry. Banastre Tarleton receives a reprimand from his superiors, but they do little else to rein him in. The man now known as Bloody Ban continues deeper into the backcountry, where the British are about to dig themselves an even bigger hole. In an effort to shore up loyalty and frighten would-be rebels, the British issue an ultimatum to Southerners.
All persons who shall neglect to return their allegiance to His Majesty's government will be considered as enemies and rebels, and treated accordingly.
In most parts of the country and in most years of the Revolution, people had been able to stay out of the way, at least partially. But now it was do or die.
The Severe Proclamation is the work of Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of the British forces in America. Clinton should have known better. Back in 1776, the British issued nearly the same document in New Jersey, banking on strong loyalist sentiment. It backfired then, and it will backfire now.
The verity here, if there is one, is if you're going to push someone off of the fence, you ought to be pretty certain which side of the fence they're going to fall on.
Now everyone must choose, for or against, loyalist or patriot. Old rivalries and fresh wounds inform their choices. The British have created a tempest in a teapot. The loyalists who do come out to join the fight for the king do so for their own agendas. And they will soon be met by an equal force, equal in number and violence, of patriots. A hornet's nest is stirred in the South, unleashing a fight that looks less like a revolution and more like a civil war. The British Army now moves deeper into the Carolina backcountry. Having declared, in a misguided proclamation, anyone not a friend an enemy, they intend to back up their words with force. But resistance is deeper than they think. Late June 1780. British Commander Sir Henry Clinton has lived in Charleston for a month now, and can sense trouble brewing in the wilderness. His response? Leave for New York and turn the Southern Command over to another officer. London, England. The man who will replace Clinton is no stranger to the American War. General Charles Cornwallis will soon return to the colonies, but a changed man. He has been in England to bury his beloved wife. Now, with her passing, Cornwallis can think only of escaping his memories, going back to the one place he hopes will be a tonic for his grief.
He is devastated. And, like many men, throws himself back into his work. In Cornwallis's case, it was the work of fighting the war.
Whether he wins or loses in the colonies is no longer the point.
I am now returning to America. Not with views of conquest and ambition. Nothing brilliant can be expected in that quarter. But I find England quite unsupportable to me. It has now no chance for me. I must shift the scene.
But Cornwallis will find the war in America changed too from how it had been fought up north. The British forces on the ground are moving further and further into unknown territory. A wild country made up of remote farms, simmering with rivalries. This is not the South of wealthy ports and rich rice farms. This is the south of fetid swamps and untamed frontiers. Here, loyalties are not so clear. Those who might be loyalist, like everyone in this backcountry frontier, harbor grudges the British don't understand. Decades of land disputes and old animosities carried to the New World by each successive wave of immigrants have poisoned the territory. All it takes is the presence of war to seriously stir things up. The South soon crawls with men like David Fanning. A struggling farmer, he had been robbed of everything he had 2 years back by a group claiming to be patriots. Now, with a powerful British mandate to ride under, he devotes himself to vengeance. Fanning also gathers more like him. Loyalist militia swarm over the backcountry with their campaign of terror. They are less interested in the outcome of the revolution than in the chance to pillage and grab land from their patriot neighbors.
I heard the horses coming in such a furious manner, but I'd no time for thought. They were up to the house, entered with drawn swords and pistols in their hands, crying out, "Where are these rebel women?" Then they began to plunder the house of everything they thought worth taking.
Eliza Wilkinson.
Patriots soon joined the fray. Men like Thomas Sumter, a former Continental soldier, take up their arms to battle the Loyalists. Stirred out of what he hoped would be retirement, Sumter gets back into the fight for personal reasons too. His house had been targeted by Loyalists. For him, as with men on both sides, the cause of independence takes a back seat to payback and plundering.
In the South, it's American against American. There are entire battles fought. In fact, there are 103 different battles in South Carolina alone where there's nary a Brit in sight. This is Tory militia against Patriot militia.
Each side attempts to outdo the other in terror and brutality. Whipping, tar and feathering, and a particularly gruesome device called the spigot becomes as commonplace as revenge.
A loyalist was placed with one foot upon a sharp pin and turned around. As cruel as this punishment might seem to those who never witnessed the unrelenting cruelties of the Loyalists, I viewed the punishment with no little satisfaction. Charles Gibson, Southern Patriot.
When the blood started to flow, it was revenge and counter-revenge. One killing provoked a counter-killing. It really tapped into these pre-revolutionary resentments and conflicts. It's like a fire feeding itself.
It is, in short, a civil war. The entire strategy was failing for Cornwallis and the British, producing not peace and order, but chaos and retribution.
What happened to Cornwallis in the South is a long and bloody guerrilla war that had by that time made it extremely dangerous for anyone to reveal he was a loyalist.
This was not the way warfare was supposed to be conducted, what people called the dogs of civil war. This was the way wars were fought in the southern backcountry.
Cornwallis must rethink the very premises of his campaign. Forget the Loyalists and their private wars. Attack the rebels where it counts most, the army.
Cornwallis is a man utterly devoid of self-doubt. He really becomes convinced that he can lick the remainder of the Southern Department of the Continental Army, so he engages what's essentially a headlong rush to complete the annihilation of this force.
From his headquarters in New Jersey, General George Washington realizes he must respond. He prepares to fortify the army in the South with new troops, and more importantly, with a new commander. But the man he wants to lead the Continental Army in the South is snubbed by Congress. Instead, the Continental Congress will send their man. They turn to General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to head up the Southern campaign. George Washington is furious. They have chosen one of his greatest rivals, and a general he considers inferior. But for now, Washington can do nothing to stop an unfolding disaster. In the Carolinas, civil order crumbles as patriots and loyalists battle each other. In July, Congress scrambles to form and equip a Southern army. At its head, against the advice of George Washington, Congress sends General Horatio Gates. Gates was the hero of Saratoga 3 years earlier when he defeated General John Burgoyne in the largest British surrender of the war. Yet there are whispers. Some say he stole credit for Saratoga from Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. That he is not the great general he claims to be. Gates, ever proud, ignores the doubters and focuses on his grand ambitions.
Horatio Gates wanted to be Commander-in-Chief of the American Army. And it goes much beyond that. Whoever was the victorious leader of the revolutionaries would emerge as the leader of a new nation. There had to be a new ruler, some new kind of ruler. No one had decided what yet. I think he might have been that ambitious and that foolish.
But the challenges of the South still await him. Gates will soon take charge of an army in a dire state. He will inherit 1,400 soldiers still reeling from the defeats at Charleston and Waxhaws. I have, says Gates, an army without strength and a military chest without money. In the barren swamplands of South Carolina, Gates's army of professional soldiers slowly starves. They are as short on provisions as they are on the will to fight. Gates does little to alleviate their conditions. His soldiers, many of whom have been in the army since the outset, turn even more bitter.
Being again disappointed, fatigued, and almost famished, their patience began to forsake them. Their looks began to be vindictive. Mutiny was ready to manifest itself. Colonel Williams.
But Gates will soon get relief. The Patriot militia, who have been fighting their own wars in the backcountry, now turn out to fight alongside the army. What they lack in experience, they make up for in spirit. The militia are itching to take on the British, and General Gates thinks they can. The Continental soldiers, now in the minority, are less sure. They foresee trouble.
We soldiers could not imagine how an army consisting of more than 2/3 militia, and which had never once been exercised in arms together, could perform in the face of an enemy. Colonel Williams.
Gates will mount his campaign against Cornwallis, ready or not. Faith in his militia and in himself is at an all-time high.
Gates has still been stung by assertions that he doesn't really deserve the credit for the victory at Saratoga. He sees an opportunity to silence his critics and show them once and for all that he, in fact, is the best and most experienced American battlefield commander, and that he can beat the British, whether on the defensive or on the offensive.
Gates's chance comes sooner than he imagines. On August 16th, the two armies stumble upon each other at Camden, South Carolina. Each side hastily sets up for a battle. 5,000 British move into position, where they will meet Gates's 3,000 men. Gates sends his militia out front, where they get their first taste of the best trained army in the world. But his audacity has caused him to make a serious tactical error, one with dire consequences. Gates places the militia on the left of his line, a position for which they are ill prepared.
The British Army will always put its best units at the right of its line, which is the place of honor. From the British perspective, the British have their best regiments facing off against the weakest and most ill-prepared American regiments.
The best of the British is led by none other than Bloody Ban Tarleton, the butcher of Waxhaws. He now leads a fierce bayonet charge into the militia.
Can't you imagine them just standing there and watching this line of red coming at them, huzzaing and presenting 18 inches of cold steel coming at them.
Fear fuels confusion on the battlefield. They are fighting a losing battle. Almost immediately, the militia panic, break, and run.
He who has never seen the effect of panic upon a multitude can have but an imperfect idea of such a thing. The best disciplined troops have been made cowards by it. Colonel Williams.
But they do not flee alone. Fast overtaking them is General Horatio Gates himself. The general who came south to gain glory now takes off on his horse as fast as possible, as far as it will carry him.
What began as a rather courageous venture now turns into a flight for his life, and he rides his 200 miles all the way back to Hillsborough without stopping, and becomes the butt of every mean-spirited joke in the Continental Army for the next 2 years.
I think he went into a complete panic. The situation was just too much for him. Alexander Hamilton praised him on his ride to safety. He said, it's quite remarkable for a man of his age to have ridden so far so fast.
The Battle of Camden scars Gates' reputation forever. It similarly tarnishes the army, and in particular, the militia. Few now believe the Patriots can hold the South, even though the future of the Revolution depends on it. The defeats at Camden and Waxhaws have decimated the Continental Southern divisions. Of the 3,000 troops who marched at Camden, over half have been killed, captured, or wounded. The majority of the Patriot militia simply disappear back into the wilds. The South has all but fallen to the British. In New Jersey, George Washington soon receives news of the defeat at Camden. Washington feared the worst when Congress appointed Horatio Gates, and the worst has happened. Gates will face court-martial. But there is a more urgent concern. Who will now lead Washington's Southern Army?
It's after Gates's debacle at Camden that Washington is finally allowed to send the man he wants. And of course he goes to Major General Nathanael Greene.
I can venture to introduce this gentleman to you as a man of abilities, bravery, and coolness. George Washington.
Nathanael Greene is Washington's most trusted subordinate. A New England patriot and fallen Quaker, Greene has proven time and time again to be one of the most brilliant commanders in the Continental Army.
truly one of America's great generals. And nobody knows who he is. Washington says, if I'm shot in battle, if I can no longer take command, the general I want to lead is Nathaniel Greene.
Among the many qualities that recommended Nathaniel Greene to George Washington was his can-do attitude. All military commanders want subordinates that will never admit defeat, that always say they can find some way to accomplish the mission.
Greene will travel far from his native New England to take on this formidable command, only to find an army ravaged and dispirited.
I am removed from almost all my friends and connections, and have to prosecute a war with almost insurmountable difficulties. I cannot contemplate my own situation without the greatest degree of anxiety. Nathaniel Greene, Continental General.
Only 800 are deemed fit for duty. The rest, Greene reports, are literally naked, starving with cold and hunger. In letter after letter, Greene beseeches the 13 colonies for supplies and troops, to no effect. He begins to fear mutiny.
It is impracticable to preserve discipline when troops are in want of everything. Be assured that you raise men in vain unless you clothe, arm, and equip them properly for the field. Nathaniel Greene.
Greene and the Southern Army have all but been abandoned. He will attempt to supply his troops through local sources, but there is a threat more urgent than starvation. Cornwallis is on the march. Greene needs a strategy and a miracle to keep his army from total destruction. The fortune Greene needs soon arrives in the form of Colonel Daniel Morgan, one of the most courageous and unusual officers the Americans have. Morgan's past is cloaked in mystery, and he never speaks of it. By age 17, he appears as part of the British Army during the French and Indian War. By then, he is already a rough and scrappy boy, hardened from a backwoods frontier life. By nature, he is a fighter and carries scars from every brawl and knockdown, including 500 lashes for punching his superior officer in his early days. From then on, Morgan becomes the stuff of patriot legend.
He really is a roughneck frontiersman. Vulgar, hard-drinking, hard-fighting man. He really is the sort of stuff of fiction.
But his rise through the ranks of the Continental Army is fact, a result of his enormous talent.
Daniel Morgan would never have been made a general in the British Army. Morgan moves ahead because of ability. And he's a great example of the coming meritocracy. You don't have to be born into the gentry to be an officer. If you have the ability, if you have the stick-to-itness.
By the time Morgan reaches the South, his hard-earned reputation and his role at major battles like Saratoga gains him the respect of patriots and the resentment of the enemy. No one is better suited to fighting in the rough southern lands than Morgan. With Morgan now at his side, Greene will enact one of the boldest and most irregular moves of the war. Greene will split his army.
Nathaniel Greene adopts what it might be considered an unconventional approach to this war. He's going to break his force. He's going to divide it into something of flying columns, very mobile columns.
He knows the British Army doesn't know the territory. And he knows that since they want to draw him into a decisive battle, he can lead them through the backwoods, through the marshes, into what are ultimately indecisive conflicts that's going to spread the British Army thin.
Greene and Morgan take off on separate paths. Greene to the southeast, Morgan to the southwest. As if on cue, Cornwallis too splits his army, sending the infamous Tarleton after Morgan, while he himself pursues Greene. The four flying armies, the prey and the predators, move through some of the roughest terrain on the eastern seaboard, each following their own will to win. Cornwallis, Greene, Tarleton, and Morgan, four ambitious and gifted leaders, now engaged in a headlong chase. On the fringes of their armies, they skirmish, confirming over and over again the proximity of each other's troops. Yet Greene and Morgan, with their lighter armies, move faster, avoiding a major battle. Instead, they draw the British deeper into the backcountry, further from supply lines and reinforcements. General Cornwallis, the British commander, grows more frustrated with each mile of rough terrain. The farther Greene goes, the more intent Cornwallis becomes on catching him.
He is going to chase Nathanael Greene all around the Carolinas, trying to gain that decisive battle. Greene, knowing better than to engage Cornwallis on Cornwallis's terms, is not going to let Cornwallis catch up to him. As close as Cornwallis gets, Greene is always able to stay one small step ahead of him.
Be a little careful and tread softly, for depend on it, you have a modern Hannibal to deal with in the person of Cornwallis.
Daniel Morgan has his own nemesis to contend with, Banastre Tarleton and his ferocious regiment. Morgan knows he can't outrun them for long. Up north, far from the swamps of the south, the war for independence looks very staid. No armies engaged, nor are battles fought. Here, the British and Continentals are at an impasse. In New York City, Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of the British in America, whiles away his time in luxury.
There was a lot of going to dinner. He put on a lot of weight. There was a lot of inspecting the troops. All the things that a parade ground general, as they were called, would do short of fighting.
The war down south is far off. Clinton receives fewer and fewer dispatches from Cornwallis, but that doesn't concern him, at least not enough to leave New York City. "50 miles away, in Hartford, Connecticut, another man with eyes on New York takes a meeting that he hopes will change the war. General George Washington hasn't seen a battle in a long while, nearly 3 years, but now his prospects may be changing. The French are in town, and Washington and his counterparts, the Marquis de Lafayette and Comte de Rochambeau, raise their glasses to a united front against the British. They toast with French wine, but it is France's navy that is on everyone's mind. 7 French warships sit in a Rhode Island harbor. Washington believes they are enough to launch an attack on New York and wrestle it back from the British. Rochambeau is more circumspect. A veteran of European wars, Rochambeau shows patience where Washington displays zeal. The French general prefers to wait for more reinforcements, much to the frustration of the Americans. Though these French ships sit idly in Newport, Rhode Island, the French have already tipped the balance of power in the war, but in less obvious ways.
From an American perspective, the French Navy has not been that significant to this point in the war. The American perspective is a little bit biased and not very complete.
In colonies and oceans all over the world, the French are taking on the British, forcing them to fight a world war in the Caribbean, to Cairo, to Calcutta.
The French Navy has helped extend the British Army and British Navy over a far wider expanse, indeed around the globe, when in the absence of the French Navy, the British were free to concentrate on North America. But the Americans don't quite see it this way.
Washington sees only that he must delay his goal of taking New York. The battles, for now, remain in the South. January 16th, South Carolina. Daniel Morgan can no longer avoid confronting Tarleton's forces. Now, he must prepare to fight. On the eve of their battle, Morgan visits with his troops. Out of 600 men, more than half are militia. The same untrained forces that were last seen fleeing the field at Camden. Morgan's challenge? Make them engage. As he faces the most grueling battle of his life, Morgan rallies these citizen soldiers.
Just hold up your head, boys. When you return to your homes, how the old folks will bless you for your gallant conduct. Daniel Morgan.
Morgan has great rapport with his troops. He loves to joke with them, to talk with them. I think they really just find him one of the great officers they've ever served under. He tells them things like, "We'll have you home soon, boys, to kiss your girlfriends."
January 17th. On a mild winter morning, the battle takes shape on a field known as Cowpens. Here, Morgan puts into play his own new strategy, one of the most inventive of the war, and most timely.
Up to that point in the war, nobody had figured out how to use militia in a formal battle. They weren't trained to meet British regulars in a formal engagement. Morgan, he figures it out.
Like others before him, Morgan puts his militia out front, the first line to meet Tarleton's charging British soldiers. Only this time, he tells them to fire just 2 shots, a quick volley, and then fall back. Against the onslaught of the British charge, they do just that.
When the British see this, they think that they have earned a replay of Camden, that they have essentially caused a rout of the militia forces who are breaking from the field. They will pursue a headlong rush and find themselves facing the very well-directed volley fires of Morgan's regulars. The result is predictable for Tarleton's Legion.
Bannister Tarleton, the aggressive and ambitious young officer, drives right into Morgan's trap. The Continentals reply with alarming force. British infantry scatter and retreat. Tarleton will try to push them on again, but within an hour, the battle is lost. Tarleton has chased Morgan all across the South to end here, defeated by the rough and tumble American at Cowpens.
Talk about a conflict of styles. You have this very arrogant, dashing, cruel British officer, young guy, and Daniel Morgan, and they're both playing for keeps. You know? How can you not love that victory when Daniel Morgan just beats the tar out of Tarleton?
Most of the entire British detachment at Cowpens is killed, captured, or wounded. This time it is bloody Bannister Tarleton who is seen fleeing the field. He will escape, soon to rejoin Cornwallis's army, thirsting for revenge. It was Morgan's win. Morgan had outplanned, outstrategized, and outled his counterpart. He had transformed his militia army at their moment of greatest need. But it will be the backcountry brawler's last battle. Morgan all along suffered quietly from painful back ailments and rheumatism.
I'd say, why is he retiring now? He's just won this big, monumental victory. And the real question is, how was he able to fight at all during the Battle of Cowpens? It's very painful for him. And his commanding officer, Nathaniel Greene, says, "You've earned the right to go home."
Morgan, who had spent a lifetime of fighting, will now watch the war from a small farm in Virginia, from the sidelines. For Nathaniel Greene, the chase is still on. Cornwallis is closing in, and with Tarleton again by his side, they will come at Greene with everything they've got. The war in the South will go on, as bloody and vicious as ever, but the stakes are rising. From the South to the North to across the Atlantic Ocean, everyone is asking the same question. How will this war end? And when? For everyone, time is running out on the American Revolution. January 27, 1781, New Jersey. The war for independence drags into its 6th year. Money, spirit, and patience are flagging throughout the army. Time is running out. Only 3 weeks into the new year, the situation reaches a crisis point. The Continental Army, exhausted and neglected, is on the verge of revolt. In no time, Washington has mutiny on his hands. His response will be determined and drastic.
Unless effectual measures are taken to place the army upon a more satisfactory footing, its dissolution and the utter ruin of our cause will be the inevitable consequences. George Washington.
The story of the mutiny began on January 1st in Morristown, New Jersey. There is little to celebrate this new year. The war has become an unrelenting misery. Soldiers from the Pennsylvania line reach their limit. Unpaid, underfed, and barely clothed, they can endure no more for the great cause.
By 1781, the Continental Army has become, in many ways, the professional organization that Washington wanted and needed it to be. But it's an army that is unhappy. They haven't been paid in a long time. And when money has been forthcoming, it has been paper money that is depreciating moment by moment. It's worth less every day. The soldiers are quite clear about the fact that they are loyal to the cause, but they want the terms of their contract to be honored.
Enraged, they voice their grievances to their superiors, but there is nothing to be done. Congress, without the right to tax, is out of money to pay its soldiers. The soldiers are not swayed.
They see this as a series of broken promises. They pledged their lives, they were spilling their blood, they thought they were making a contract to serve their country. But the country isn't honoring the contract.
The officers watch from the comfort of their quarters. Some are sympathetic, but others brush the soldiers' concerns aside. Suddenly, the ideas of the revolution, the talk of liberty and equality for all men, seem no longer to apply.
I don't think the fact that the officers had better clothing, better food, better equipment endeared them to the regular troops who were so cold and so hungry and so behind in their pay.
Within the revolution, a rebellion grows. On January 2nd, camps empty as 1,300 soldiers, 1/4 of the Northern Army, up and leave. They march out, taking cannon and weapons, with one destination in mind: Continental Congress, a 2-day march away in Philadelphia. Their plan? Make Congress listen.
They get as far as Princeton. They seize the town of Princeton. Washington sends an army to surround them, and they negotiate a peaceful settlement. The troops who want to go home get their money. The troops who want to stay get the clothing they need. About half of them go home. And that's the end of it.
Washington begs Congress for money and provisions as the only way to pacify his army. It is too little, too late.
As I have used every endeavor in my power to avert the evil that has come upon us, so will I continue to exert every means to prevent an extension of the mischief. But I can neither foretell or be answerable for the issue. George Washington.
Fresh unrest spreads among other camps. They too want what they believe they are owed. January 20th, 1781. Pompton, New Jersey. Now 200 soldiers from the New Jersey line rebel. They too begin their march to Congress. But this time, Washington will strike them down. For the sake of the revolution, these mutinies must end.
He couldn't have an army where mutinies took place and hundreds of men left and went home. The army would implode and the war would be lost. Worse, any mutiny leads the British to believe that the army is collapsing and to renew their fervor to win the war. Washington's view is, that's it, enough's enough.
The mutineers don't get far. All are quickly captured. Among them, 3 men, the ringleaders, are sentenced to death by firing squad. But they are not the only ones who will pay a heavy price for their insubordination.
In a cruel move, Washington then gets their 12 closest friends, 12 men who were with them in the mutiny but not quite the ringleaders, and orders them to shoot them. The men in the Jersey line are aghast at this. For the commander to order, not only to order the 3 men shot, but shot by their friends. But at the same time, terrified. It could have been me.
This was a most painful task. When ordered to load, some of them shed tears. James Thatcher, Continental Doctor.
The first 6 men fire. But they have deliberately aimed high, sending a volley over the heads of the condemned men. The second 6 are immediately assembled, and under penalty of death themselves, ordered to shoot. This time, the shots find their target. The punishment sends a clear message. Sedition will no longer be tolerated in the Continental Army.
After the execution of those men in that terrible winter of 1781, there were no more mutinies.
But the unrest in his army has shaken Washington. His authority and the revolution are slipping away. He must find a way to end this war. Now. In the South, the war continues without pause, an ongoing showdown between two determined armies. Having surprisingly beaten the British at the Battle of Cowpens, the Continentals steady themselves for revenge. The British will seek to make an all-or-nothing push to annihilate the rebel force. General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, has become singular in his obsession. He will not stop until he can make the Continental Army stand and fight. Instead, the rebels keep pulling Cornwallis deeper into the backcountry. On a cat-and-mouse chase led by his arch-rival, General Nathaniel Greene.
Cornwallis himself believes that if he can draw Nathaniel Greene into one decisive fight, if he can bring this war to one pitched battle somewhere in the South, the battle's going to be over. Greene won't give him that satisfaction.
General Nathaniel Greene knows better. He learned early on in battles like New York and Brandywine that keeping the army away from direct confrontation is paramount. Like a boxer who realizes his opponent hits harder, Greene's plan is to keep moving, to wear down and exhaust his enemy. If he can buy time, he can get reinforcements. Greene draws Cornwallis step by step farther from his lines of supply, farther from the possibility of reinforcements, farther from the point of no return. Greene has been leading a chase for months that zigzags across the South. Through swamp and forest, Cornwallis manages to stay close, often trailing by a few hundred yards. But the Continentals are like a mirage that disappears as he draws near. The two sides regularly skirmish amongst scouting parties, but the main armies never meet. Greene's Continental force is smaller, lighter, and faster. The British, by contrast, are encumbered. They will need to take extreme measures to keep up. To lighten his load, Cornwallis orders an enormous bonfire built, onto which all the unnecessary trappings of a distinguished British army are thrown. Wagons, tents, clothing, fine china, silver, and cask upon cask of rum.
Cornwallis is very earnest. He does not want to allow Greene to escape. He is going to do anything within his power to catch up to Greene.
In this situation, without baggage, necessaries, with zeal and bayonets only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara.
It is a fateful decision that he will pay for later. The race picks up speed. The two armies begin to travel at an almost inhuman pace, moving as much as 40 miles in a single day. Greene now sees only one chance for survival. As Cornwallis chases him toward the Virginia border, Greene makes a daring move. He splits his army, sending one branch toward the upper Dan River, while the main army moves east, where Greene has commandeered all the boats along the crossings. Cornwallis, fooled, dutifully follows the decoy.
It bought Greene the time he needed to move down the river to the point where the Continentals had gathered all of the boats on that river and crossed at a point that Cornwallis could not hope to cross.
Greene's plan works. He moves his entire regiment, all 2,000 men, across the Dan, reaching the other side just in time. The British, realizing the ploy, rush to the crossing, arriving just hours after the last of Greene's boats leave. Cornwallis, so close to the victory he sought, recognizes that the chase is over. The cheers from the Continentals are so loud they can be heard across the river, a taunting sound to the British. But it is genuine joy. After marching more than 200 miles in just 1 month, Greene's army can finally rest. Greene will not stay in Virginia long. He will get what he needs, new supplies and new recruits, and change his game. The hunted will become the hunter. Here in the South and beyond, the tide is about to turn. Far from the swamps of the southern colonies, another chase drags on. France, 1781, the Court of Versailles. The venerable diplomat Benjamin Franklin is still in hot pursuit of France's money. Lately, it has become elusive. King Louis XVI, America's ally against the British, has given more than $100 million in direct aid to the revolution. In fact, he's going broke funding the Americans. Yet it never seems to be enough to satisfy Ben Franklin.
Franklin gets these truly amazing shopping lists from Congress. They are requisition lists for everything from thimbles and shovels and thread and drums and paintbrushes too. Oh, and by the way, 30,000 blankets and 50,000 uniforms, and a ship of the line would be nice too. Franklin's essentially constantly approaching them with his tin cup and being told, but we already gave it the office. You're being told we've already given you X. How can we possibly cough up more?
Franklin is caught between two masters. On one hand, he must convince the French that the American Revolution can still be won. On the other, he must assure Congress that French aid, the key to the war, is on its way. Some Americans, like General Washington, have reason to doubt it.
Washington was always confused and perplexed, and until the end disappointed in the French. The soldiers that they did promise didn't get here fast enough. He didn't feel that there were enough of them. He's worried about the help that the French have given him, if it's going to be in time.
Unbeknownst to Washington, his concerns are being answered. Quietly, on its own schedule and with its own agenda, the French Navy finally makes a move that will change the war. March 1781. On the eastern coast of France, a shipment is being prepared. The mighty French warship, the Ville de Paris, readies for a long voyage to the Americas. At its helm, the Admiral François-Joseph Paul Comte de Grasse, one of France's most talented admirals and greatest glory seekers. De Grasse's stated mission is in the Caribbean, where France's critical trading interests lie. But if the timing is right, de Grasse plans to visit North America. After all, this is a war against the British, a cause beloved by all French.
It's important to remember that France is in this conflict not to secure American independence. France is in this conflict to humiliate the British government, to hopefully seize some territory from Britain, and to slice off a major part of the North American empire from the British Empire.
America may be a pawn in this game between superpowers, but the rebels can still make their own luck. Their next moves will shape fresh opportunities for all sides. February 22nd, 1781. General Nathanael Greene pushes his players into position. He readies his army, now regrouped and resupplied, to cross back into North Carolina, where he will now seek the confrontation with Cornwallis he once avoided. Crossing again over the Dan River, Greene soon draws Cornwallis back into the chase. Only this time, Greene leads the desperate British commander toward a spot favorable to the Continentals. They will take the high ground at a small junction called Guilford Courthouse. March 15th. Greene sets his army first. Cornwallis, weakened from lack of provisions, nonetheless prepares to throw all he has left at winning. Cornwallis's men soon break through Greene's militia lines. They bear down on the rest of the army with bayonets. The Continentals face the charge. The two sides fall upon each other at close quarters. A bloody melee fought hand to hand. Fearing loss, Cornwallis makes a desperate and brutal decision.
Cornwallis turns to the lieutenant in charge of artillery and orders him to fire grape right into the mass of struggling men, both Americans and British, in order to break it up.
The cannon cut down as many British as Americans. But it is enough to stop the rebels. Greene orders his men to retreat. He cannot and will not risk his soldiers. Cornwallis is victorious, but only by sacrificing his own men. Twice as many British die in the victory as Continentals perish in the loss. It is the kind of win that feels, ultimately, more like a defeat. The months spent chasing Greene have cost Cornwallis greatly and gained him nothing. Defeat of the rebel army is not 1 inch closer to him. He will leave the Carolinas an ambiguous victor in search of more decisive battles. But he leaves the British strategy in tatters, just at the moment the Continentals and their French allies are about to move as one. Losses in the south and stalemate in the north have left the British command in America in disarray. Worse, public confidence back home is weakening. London, England, 1781. All of Britain is tiring of this increasingly unpopular conflagration, whose costs in money and human life continue to escalate. King George and his cabinet may try to spin it differently, but they cannot change the facts. The insurgent colonies are showing no signs of submission.
The British people are saying, come on home. What's in this for us? They're wondering, how is this going to end? How is this going to play out? Or is this just going to go on forever?
The rift between those who wish to end the war fast and those who take the long view travels over the Atlantic. In America, the King's commanders will soon find themselves with opposing strategies of war. In New York, Sir Henry Clinton, the overall British commander, takes a patient view of things. It's easy for him, surrounded as he is by all the luxuries the colonies have to offer.
Clinton has 4 houses that he lives in New York. He's living pretty high on the hog, well supplied. Certainly his liquor bill is remarkably high. Found great enjoyment in the arms of Mrs. Badley, who was the wife of a British officer. I would guess it was hard for Clinton to leave New York. It was comfortable, it was loving, at least Mrs. Badley was.
The way Clinton conducts the war from New York, it's almost like he's waiting for events to throw him an advantage that he can then act upon. Cornwallis's instincts are to act. Cornwallis's instincts are to fight them to death.
Now, my dear friend, what is our plan? Without one, we cannot succeed. If we mean an offensive war in America, we must abandon New York and bring our whole force into Virginia. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis pushes his contest into Virginia, but he is soon cut short. Clinton, opting for defensive wars, orders him to set up a protective base along the coast.
This adventure through the South inland is not working. We need to make sure that we secure the kinds of bases, the footholds that will allow us to maintain our position in North America and fight another day.
Cornwallis has no choice but to obey his commander. He turns his army toward a small coastal village, to a place called Yorktown. Once, Yorktown was known solely as a tobacco trading port, but it will soon become a major battlefield, and for some, a place of destiny. July, the Caribbean. France's Admiral de Grasse makes his long-awaited appearance.
The fall is hurricane season in the Americas. This is a time when, for the most part, shipping comes to a complete pause in the Caribbean. And so it's the right moment for de Grasse to leave the Caribbean and assist their allies in North America.
I am sorry to see the distress in which the American continent finds itself. You can note the desire I have to provoke a change in your favor of the situation. Admiral de Grasse.
The French Navy, thus far an absent player in the Revolution, now turns north with 28 ships, 3,000 men, and long-awaited money to pay Continental soldiers. But they also come with a catch. It will be the French, not Washington, who decide where they will land. In their view, the British are weakest in Virginia, near the Chesapeake Bay, at the small port of Yorktown.
Washington had his heart set on retaking New York, but when de Grasse says he's going to the Chesapeake, he's going to be there just for a certain time, Washington then makes really the greatest decision of his career. He knows, he seems to sense that this is the time. This is the time to strike.
It may be declared in a word that we are at the end of our tether, and that now or never our deliverance must come.
George Washington. With all he has, every soldier, every cannon, every French reinforcement, Washington moves south. The general now returns to Virginia, his beloved homeland. In search of the battle he hopes will end the war. Washington breaks his stride just once, as he rides ahead of his army on a mission of a more personal nature. For the first time since the beginning of the Revolution, Washington visits his home.
He goes home to Mount Vernon, and I think the whole point of the war is brought home again to him on a very personal level.
He had seen Martha only rarely, and he had grown out of touch with Mount Vernon. Now he delves into the details that a man of the house, not the general of an army, would attend to. There is the ongoing renovation of Mount Vernon and the particulars of running a southern plantation. 6 years ago, he left them behind to take charge of a rebellion that turned into a revolution, and a revolution that turned into a world war. Now, he longs for it to be over.
This is what I'm fighting for. On one hand, and then on the other hand, it's when can I get home? I'm fighting for this, but I want to be here so much.
George Washington is not the only one who came into his own in these many years. Washington's only son, Jackie, had come of age too. Long kept out of the army by his overprotective parents, Jackie now makes a final plea to follow his father into battle. This time, Washington softens. It is a testament to Washington's confidence. With all good fortune, the end of the war is at hand. A convergence is taking shape. As Admiral de Grasse sails up toward Virginia from the Caribbean, the Continental Army, now joined by 5,000 French troops, also heads toward the Chesapeake Bay. There, General Cornwallis hastens to build his defenses at Yorktown. But he is beginning to feel that he is sitting at the center of a dangerous trap. Cornwallis raises the alarm. He writes to Clinton in New York.
Sir, if I had no hopes of relief, I would rather risk an action than defend my half-finished defenses. But if you cannot relieve me very soon, you must be prepared to hear the worst. General Charles Cornwallis.
Clinton's response? Vague promises.
Your lordship may be assured I shall endeavour to reinforce the army under your command by all the means within my power. Sir Henry Clinton.
Cornwallis will soon find himself hanging on those promises, while Washington and the French will get their chance to fulfill the promise of alliance. For each player, the war's endgame has arrived. The Continental Army, after a year of deadlock and disloyalty, is now moving as one en route to Yorktown and the largest offensive of the war. America, fatigued after 6 years of fighting, holds its breath. Independence, their glorious cause, feels within its grasp once more. September 5th. Admiral de Grasse and his French fleet arrive first to the Chesapeake Bay and take on the inadequate British force sent to chase him out. The two navies clash at sea for 4 days. Both fleets are badly hurt, but it is the British who must give up the bay.
They needed to drive de Grasse out of the mouth of the Chesapeake, and that they failed to do.
De Grasse, in one pivotal battle, captures control of all that comes into or out of Yorktown. General Cornwallis knows his situation is worsening. He needs more help. He needs reinforcements. His commander, Henry Clinton, has not budged from New York.
Sir Henry Clinton to Earl Cornwallis, New York. Your Lordship may be assured that I am doing everything in my power to relieve you, if the winds permit and no unforeseen accident happen. This, however, is subject to disappointment. Sir Henry Clinton.
Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, I shall have no doubt, if relief arrives in any reasonable time, York will be in the possession of His Majesty's troops. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis, feeling magnanimous, takes faith in Clinton's tepid promises. Imprudently, he stays put. One by one, his routes of escape are cut off. De Grasse's ships inch up the York River. George Washington takes the south. French ground troops occupy the north and west. 17,000 French and Continental soldiers now surround Cornwallis. Washington presents his plan. Launch a massive frontal assault on Cornwallis. His European allies disagree.
Yorktown has now become heavily fortified. Washington will lose a lot of men in the assault. General Rochambeau, the French commander, suggests a long-range siege of cannon and mortar. Washington sees it as a better strategy. One of his great gifts as a commander was to listen to other people and often do what other people suggested, even if he was against it at first.
On October 6th, the siege begins. Trenches are dug that will, in time, envelop Yorktown, like the tightening of a noose.
Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, the enemy made their first parallel on the night of the 6th. On the evening of the 9th, their batteries opened, and have since continued firing without intermission. Against so powerful an attack, we cannot hope to make a very long resistance. General Charles Cornwallis.
A lot of a siege is about the timing. Can you force a city to surrender before the city gets reinforcements? Can you get closer and closer in your parallel trenches as you move towards the city line of defenses?
October 11th, the second parallel is dug, closing the circle around Yorktown. Still, there is no sign of Clinton's reinforcements.
October 11th, 5 p.m. Since my last letter was written, we have lost 30 men. I have only to repeat, nothing but a direct move can save me. General Charles Cornwallis.
Clinton promises support, and Clinton promises support, and Clinton promises support, and Cornwallis waits for the support, and he waits for the support, and it doesn't arrive.
The siege daily is becoming more and more formidable. His Lordship Cornwallis must view his situation as extremely critical, if not desperate. James Thatcher, American officer.
October 14th, 8 p.m. Washington's troops close in and make a full-scale attack on the outer redoubts of the fort.
October 15th, Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, my situation now becomes very critical. The safety of this place is so precarious that I cannot recommend you run great risk in endeavoring to save us. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis's letter will not be read. Clinton has already set sail from New York. But the belated relief effort will not be in time. His window has closed. For 6 long years, Washington fought a war marked more by loss than victory. Now his day has come. The general's finest hour begins quietly with a lone British drummer spotted coming through the smoke.
The enemy beat a parley, and Lord Cornwallis proposed a cessation of hostilities to settle terms for the surrender of the posts. To this he was answered that a desire to spare the further effusion of blood would readily incline me to accept of the surrender, but that I wished to have it in writing. George Washington.
When he got Cornwallis's letter proposing the cessation of hostilities, his heart must have been ready to burst. Because I think he must have known, just as Cornwallis knew, that was it. This was the end.
To Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, I have the mortification to inform your Excellency that I have been forced to surrender the troops under my command. I never saw this post in a very favourable light. General Charles Cornwallis.
General Henry Clinton can barely contemplate the consequences of his inaction. He had set in motion the endgame, and then sat idly while it played out. Now the Southern British Army is lost, and possibly the war itself. October 19th, 1781. "7,000 redcoats lay down their arms in front of General George Washington. On this momentous occasion, only one person is missing. General Charles Cornwallis avoids the ceremony, claiming illness. No doubt he felt worse on this day than any other in his long military career.
How could this have happened? Cornwallis is so humiliated and so stricken by the defeat that he cannot surrender in person to George Washington.
October 27th. Cornwallis and Washington will meet a week later when Cornwallis, in a show of respect, invites Washington to his headquarters. What the two men discuss is not recorded. But surely they must have shared the same thought. Now they come together as equals, as the commanders from two nations. One ancient and powerful, the other on the verge of being born.
For the Americans, certainly there are euphoric feelings of victory. Now, though, the more difficult task of building a nation begins.
Washington, the general, is about to exit the stage to make way for Washington, the statesman and nation builder. A challenge he cannot yet conceive. But before he can look to the future, Washington is pulled back into the present. Victory has come at a terrible price, a personal tragedy that will forever scar the general. During the siege, Washington's son Jackie, who finally came to fight alongside his father, falls ill to a devastating camp fever. Washington and Martha arrive in time to see their son alive, but only briefly. Jackie soon dies, at the very last, a victim of America's crusade at Yorktown.
At the same time, the country is celebrating in jubilation through all the colonies at the victory of Yorktown. The commander-in-chief who brought them that victory is mourning, deep in grief, over the death of his son and his final child. George and Martha have now lost all their children.
It is the final, ultimate sacrifice for the Virginia farmer who stepped up to lead his fledgling country. At last, it seems the revolution is coming to an end. But Washington, like the thousands of Americans who fought and died alongside him, must wonder at the extraordinary cost of independence. Spring 1775. Bloodshed at Lexington and Concord has inflamed the colonies,